At parents' wedding celebration, they seated me near the kitchen. Then my jet arrived on the lawn. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, sliding through my mail slot like a ghost from a past I'd spent 5 years trying to forget. Thick cardstock, gold foil lettering, the kind of expensive stationery that screams, "Look how well we're doing now." My mother's name was embossed at the top. Dr. Patricia Williams Chin cordially invites you to celebrate her marriage to Mr. David Chin. Her third marriage. Third time's the charm, right? I stood in my penthouse kitchen, still in my silk pajamas, holding that invitation like it might bite me. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting shadows across my marble countertops. Outside, Manhattan buzzed with its usual energy, but inside my apartment, everything felt frozen. 26 years old, and a piece of paper from my mother could still make me feel like that scared little girl who never seemed to get anything right. "You're throwing your life away, Zara," her voice echoed in my memory. "All that money I spent on medical school, and you want to quit for what? Playing with computers? Making silly investments with rich people's money." That conversation happened exactly 4 years, 7 months, and 12 days ago. Not that I was counting. I flipped the invitation over. There was a handwritten note on the back in my mother's perfect cursive. "I know we haven't talked, but I hope you'll come. David's family will be there, and I'd like them to meet you. Please dress appropriately. Mom. Dress appropriately." Classic mom. Even in her attempt at reconciliation, she couldn't resist a little dig. I walked over to my home office, where 3 monitors displayed real-time updates from the stock market. My venture capital firm, Apex Ventures, had just closed another round of funding for a biotech startup that was about to revolutionize cancer treatment. The deal was worth $47 million. I'd negotiated it while eating takeout sushi in my pajamas last night. But to my mother, I was still just the daughter who threw away her future. The truth was more complicated than that. I hadn't thrown anything away. I'd built something incredible. When I left medical school, I had $2,000 in my checking account and a laptop that crashed every time I opened too many browser tabs. Now, I owned a firm that managed over $300 million in assets. I had investments in 43 companies across 6 industries. Last month, Forbes had featured me in their 30 Under 30 list, calling me the quiet force reshaping venture capital. Quiet force. They had no idea how quiet I'd been. The smart thing would have been to throw the invitation away, block my mother's number again, continue living my successful, peaceful life without the drama of family complications. I had a conference call with Tokyo in an hour, followed by a board meeting for one of my portfolio companies. My assistant, Marcus, had already sent me 3 reminder texts about my schedule. But something about that invitation nagged at me. Maybe it was the way she'd signed it, Mom, instead of her full name, like she used to do on my report cards. Maybe it was curiosity about who this David Chin was, and why my mother thought he was worth a 3rd trip down the aisle. Or maybe, if I was being completely honest with myself, some tiny part of me still hoped she might be proud of what I'd accomplished. I set the invitation down and picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I hadn't called in years. My finger hovered over Mom's name for what felt like forever. Then I put the phone away and opened my laptop instead. If I was going to do this, I was going to do it right. I spent the next hour researching David Chin. He wasn't hard to find, apparently. He loved talking to the press. Tech entrepreneur, according to his LinkedIn. CEO of a company called InnovateFlow that specialized in business automation software. He'd given several interviews about building his empire from nothing and the American dream in action. Interesting. I recognized the company name, but I couldn't quite place it. I called Marcus. "Clear my schedule for this weekend. I need to attend a wedding." "The Singapore Tech Summit is this weekend," he reminded me. "You're supposed to be the keynote speaker. Send my apologies. Tell them I have a family emergency." It wasn't technically a lie. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. I booked a hotel room in my hometown, a place I'd avoided for years. I arranged for a rental car, something modest and unremarkable. Most importantly, I made sure none of my usual entourage knew where I was going. No assistants, no security, no business partners. Just me. I wanted to arrive exactly as I'd left, alone, underestimated, and completely invisible. The night before the wedding, I sat in my hotel room trying on the dress I'd chosen. Black, elegant, but not flashy. Nothing that would scream successful venture capitalist. I wanted to blend in, to observe, to see if my family had changed at all in our years apart. Looking in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. Not because of the dress, but because of everything else. The confidence in my posture, the way I held my shoulders, the knowledge behind my eyes of everything I'd built while they weren't watching. 5 years ago, when I walked away from that last argument with my mother, I'd been broken. Rejected by the one person whose approval I'd spent my whole life chasing. Tonight, I was someone else entirely. Someone who didn't need anyone's approval because I'd learned to approve of myself. But deep down, underneath all that growth and success, part of me was still that hurt daughter who just wanted her mother to see her, really see her, and be proud. Tomorrow, I'd find out if that was possible, or if some bridges were burned too thoroughly to ever be rebuilt. I folded the invitation carefully and tucked it into my purse. Whatever happened at this wedding, it was going to be interesting. The venue was exactly what I'd expected from my mother, over the top in all the wrong ways. Rolling green lawns, white tents that probably cost more than most people's cars, and enough flowers to supply a small country. I arrived 30 minutes early, partly out of habit and partly because I wanted to observe before anyone noticed me. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a sleek black dress that looked expensive, but not obviously so, paired with understated jewelry. Professional, but not flashy. I wanted to see how they'd treat me when they thought I was still the same failed daughter who disappointed them years ago. The wedding planner, a thin woman with clipboard and headset, approached me at the entrance. Her smile was the kind you give to people you think don't matter. "Name?" she asked, not looking up from her list. "Zara Williams." She scanned down the page, her manicured finger stopping halfway.
"Oh.
"Yes, sir. Table 18. The way she said it, like she was apologizing for bad news she didn't want to deliver. Table 18 turned out to be exactly where you'd expect them to put the family disappointment. Wedged between a swinging kitchen door and an ice sculpture shaped like a swan, it was close enough to smell whatever the caterers were preparing, but far enough from the main action that you might as well be invisible. Every other table had a clear view of the stage where my mother and David would exchange vows. Table 18 faced the kitchen.
Perfect."
I took my seat and watched the other guests arrive. Uncle Jerome, who always bragged about his chain of car dealerships. Cousin Michelle, who'd become a lawyer, just like my mother always wanted me to be. My mother's sister Janet, who'd never missed an opportunity to point out my flaws growing up. They were all seated closer to the front, of course. Close enough to matter. It took 20 minutes before anyone approached my table. Michelle spotted me first, her eyes widening with what might have been surprise or horror. "Zara? Oh my God, I can't believe you came." She hugged me like we were long-lost friends instead of relatives who'd barely tolerated each other growing up. "You look different." "Good different," she added quickly. "Thanks. You look great too." I meant it. Success had been kind to Michelle. Designer dress, professional highlights, the kind of confidence that came from always being the golden child. "So, what have you been up to? Mom mentioned you left medical school, but that was years ago. Are you working now?" Before I could answer, my cousin Jerome Jr. wandered over with a drink in his hand.
"Zara."
The prodigal daughter returns. "Didn't you used to do something with websites?" Something with websites. 5 years of building one of the most successful venture capital firms on the East Coast, and that's what it had been reduced to in family legend. "Something like that," I said, smiling.
"What about you?"
"Still helping Dad sell cars." His face tightened slightly. Jerome Jr. had always been sensitive about working for his father instead of building his own empire. "Actually, I'm expanding into digital marketing now. The future is online, you know?" I nodded seriously. "Absolutely. The future is definitely online." More family members drifted over as the ceremony approached. Each conversation followed the same pattern: surprise that I'd shown up, vague questions about what I'd been doing, and barely concealed pity for the girl who'd thrown her life away. Nobody asked any follow-up questions. Nobody seemed particularly interested in the details of my life. I was the cautionary tale, the reminder of what happened when you didn't follow the family plan. My mother finally appeared, radiant in white silk that probably cost more than my first car. She spotted me across the lawn and hesitated for just a moment, like she was gathering courage. Then she walked over, her new stepchildren trailing behind her like accessories. "Zara, sweetheart, you came." Her hug was brief, formal, the kind you give to acquaintances at networking events. "Congratulations, Mom. You look beautiful." "Thank you. I'd like you to meet David's children, Emma and Tyler." "Kids, this is my daughter Zara." Emma, maybe 16, looked me up and down with the casual cruelty only teenagers can master. "Oh, you're the one who dropped out of medical school?" My mother's face flushed. "Emma, that's not." "It's fine," I interrupted. "Yes, I left medical school. Sometimes life takes you in unexpected directions." Tyler, who couldn't have been older than 12, chimed in. "Dad says people who quit medical school usually end up doing nothing important." Out of the mouths of babes and future stepchildren. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced down discreetly. ETA, 45 minutes. Clearance confirmed. Captain Rodriguez. "I'm sorry, I need to take this call," I said, excusing myself from the group. "Business." I walked across the manicured lawn toward a quieter area, my heels sinking slightly into the perfect grass. Behind me, I could hear Emma asking my mother, what kind of business could she have? "Good question, Emma. Good question." The second text came as I reached the edge of the property. Flight plan filed. Landing site prepared. All systems go. I smiled, looking back at the elegant chaos of my mother's wedding. Table 18 sat empty, waiting for me to return. The kitchen door swung open and closed as servers rushed back and forth with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The ice sculpture was already starting to melt in the afternoon sun. In 45 minutes, everything was going to change. The family that had spent 5 years writing me off as a failure was about to learn exactly what kind of business I'd been building while they weren't paying attention. I walked back toward my table, past the relatives who'd forgotten I existed, past the stepchildren who thought I was nothing, past my mother who still saw me as her greatest disappointment. They had no idea what was coming, but they would soon enough. The ceremony was everything my mother had probably dreamed of. String quartet, rose petals scattered down a white carpet, and enough photographers to cover a red carpet event. I watched from table 18 as she glided down the aisle, radiant and confident in a way I'd never seen her before. For a moment, I almost forgot why I was here. She looked genuinely happy. David Chun waited at the altar in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, beaming like he'd won the lottery. Maybe he had. My mother was successful, beautiful, and came with a network of influential friends from her medical practice. Not a bad catch for a tech entrepreneur trying to climb social ladders. I found myself studying him during the vows. Mid-40s, silver threading through his black hair, the kind of confident posture that came from years of boardroom presentations. He had good bone structure and an expensive smile. When he spoke his vows, his voice carried across the lawn with practiced ease. "Patricia, you've taught me that it's never too late to build something beautiful," he said, his hand holding hers. "Just like I built my company from nothing, we're building a future together from the ground up." Several guests murmured approvingly. I heard Aunt Janet whisper to someone, "Self-made man. Started with nothing and built an empire." The ceremony concluded with champagne toasts and enough cheering to wake the deceased. As guests mingled during cocktail hour, I stayed near my table, observing and listening. The conversations swirled around David's success story, how he'd bootstrapped his company, how he'd taken risks, how he'd turned his vision into millions. Innovate Flow is revolutionizing business automation, I heard Uncle Jerome tell someone. David says they're projecting 300% growth this year. Innovate Flow. That name kept nagging at me, like a song you can't quite remember, but can't get out of your head. Then David took the microphone for his reception speech, and everything clicked into place. 5 years ago, I had a dream and a laptop, he began, his voice carrying across the lawn. Innovate Flow was just an idea, a way to help businesses streamline their operations through intelligent automation. But dreams don't fund themselves. My blood ran cold. I remember the early days, working 18-hour shifts, living on ramen noodles, trying to convince anyone to believe in my vision. Then, like a miracle, I got my first major investor. Anonymous funding through a shell company called Meridian Holdings. Whoever that angel investor was, they saw something in Innovate Flow when no one else would. The champagne glass in my hand suddenly felt very heavy. Meridian Holdings,
My shell company.
one of the first investments I'd made when I was still learning the ropes of venture capital. A small software startup with promising technology, but terrible marketing. I remembered the pitch deck, remembered the late-night calls with the development team, remembered signing the paperwork that gave me a 15% stake for $2.2 million. But that was just the beginning. That first investment saved us, David continued, his voice growing stronger. It allowed us to hire real developers, to scale our platform, to start landing major clients. We've grown from 3 employees to over 200. We've gone from that tiny apartment to offices in 5 cities. I pulled out my phone discreetly, fingers flying across the screen as I accessed my portfolio management app. There it was, Innovate Flow Incorporated. But the numbers were much different than David was telling the crowd. Initial investment, $2.2 million for 15% equity. Follow-up investments through various shell companies, $8.7 million. Current stake, 62%. 62%. I didn't just invest in David's company, I owned it. The beautiful thing about the American dream, David was saying, is that with hard work and determination, anyone can build something from nothing. Innovate Flow proves that vision and persistence always win in the end. I almost laughed out loud. Vision and persistence. Try venture capital and strategic acquisitions. Over the past 5 years, every time David had needed funding for expansion, for new technology, for market penetration, my firm had been there. Always through different shell companies, always with non-disclosure agreements, always structured to keep the ultimate source of funding private. It was standard practice in my industry. Entrepreneurs often performed better when they didn't know exactly who was pulling the strings. But this wasn't just any entrepreneur. This was my mother's new husband, standing up at their wedding reception, bragging about building an empire from nothing, while completely unaware that the nothing he'd started with had been funded by the daughter his new wife considered a failure. The best part, David continued, is that we just finalized our biggest deal yet. Last month, we were acquired by a major investment firm. The deal hasn't been announced publicly yet, but I can tell you it's going to set us up for the next decade of growth. My phone buzzed with another text. ETA 15 minutes. Ready for landing. I smiled, looking up at David as he basked in the applause of guests who had no idea they were clapping for a man whose success story was about to get very complicated. Because that major investment firm he was bragging about, that was me too. Apex Ventures had been quietly acquiring smaller firms all year, building a portfolio of companies that would eventually roll up under our umbrella. Innovate Flow was scheduled to be announced as part of our Q3 acquisitions next month. David Chin hadn't just married my mother. He'd married into a family with the one person who could make or break everything he'd worked for. And he had no idea. I stood up from table 18, smoothed my dress, and walked toward the edge of the lawn. It was time to make some calls. In 15 minutes, my jet would land on the private airstrip we'd secured for the evening. In 20 minutes, my investment team would arrive. In 30 minutes, David Chen was going to learn that the anonymous angel investor who'd saved his company was sitting right there at the table next to the kitchen. The table they'd given to the family failure. The table that was about to become the most powerful seat at this entire wedding. The first sign was the sound, a low rumble that started in the distance, barely audible over the string quartet and cocktail chatter. A few guests looked up, confused, as if they couldn't quite place what they were hearing. Uncle Jerome paused mid-sentence in his conversation about real estate investments. Cousin Michelle stopped laughing at whatever joke someone had just told. But I knew exactly what it was. David was still at the microphone, transitioning into thank yous and toasts when the rumble grew louder. Much louder. The kind of sound that makes crystal glasses vibrate on tables and turns casual conversation impossible. "What is that?" someone shouted over the noise. I watched from my position near the edge of the lawn as heads turned skyward. There, descending through the clear afternoon sky like something out of a movie, was my Gulfstream G650. Sleek, white, and worth more than most people's houses. The pilot, Captain Rodriguez, was executing a perfect approach to the private landing strip we'd arranged 2 miles away, close enough to be visible, close enough to be heard, close enough to stop this wedding reception dead in its tracks. The musicians stopped playing. Conversations died mid-word. Even the caterers emerged from the kitchen, craning their necks to see what was happening. 200 wedding guests stood frozen, staring at a private jet making an unscheduled appearance at what had been, moments before, a perfectly orchestrated celebration. David squinted into the sky, his hand shading his eyes. Is that landing here? It's probably just passing overhead," my mother said quickly, but her voice carried the uncertainty of someone who had no idea what was happening at her own wedding. The jet touched down with precision that would have made me proud under any other circumstances. Even from this distance, I could see the Apex Ventures logo discreetly placed near the nose, small enough to be tasteful, large enough to be noticed by anyone who knew what to look for. Nobody here knew what to look for.
Yet.
"Whose jet is that?" Aunt Janet asked, her voice cutting through the confused murmur of guests. I checked my phone. Right on schedule. The ground crew would need 5 minutes to secure the aircraft and deploy the stairs. My investment team would need another 3 minutes to make the walk from the landing strip to the wedding venue. That gave me 8 minutes to position myself exactly where I needed to be. I started walking across the lawn, my heels clicking against the temporary walkways that had been laid down for the event. Every step took me closer to the center of attention, closer to the microphone that David was still holding like he couldn't quite figure out what to do with it. "Excuse me," I said, approaching the makeshift stage area. Several guests turned to look at me, probably wondering why the girl from table 18 was suddenly walking toward the front of the reception. David looked down at me with polite confusion. "I'm sorry, do you need something?" "Actually, yes. I need to borrow that microphone for just a moment. I'm not sure this is the right time." "Trust me," I said, extending my hand. "This is exactly the right time." My mother appeared at my elbow, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Zara, what are you doing? Whose jet is that?" Before I could answer, 3 figures appeared at the edge of the lawn. Marcus, my assistant, who never traveled anywhere without his tablet and phone. Sarah Chun, no relation to David, my head of acquisitions, impeccably dressed even after flight. And bringing up the rear, James Morrison, my legal counsel, carrying a briefcase that probably contained more important documents than most people would see in a lifetime. The wedding guests parted like the Red Sea as my team approached. There was something about the way they moved, purposeful, professional, expensive, that made it clear they weren't here for the celebration. "Oh my God," I heard someone whisper. "They're heading straight for her." Marcus reached me first, his expression perfectly neutral. "Ms. Williams, all the documents are prepared. Are you ready to proceed?" The entire reception had gone silent now. 200 guests, my mother, David, even the wedding planner with her clipboard. Everyone was staring at me like I'd just materialized from another dimension. David slowly lowered the microphone, his eyes moving from my team to me and back again. "I'm sorry, but who exactly are you people?" I smiled, the same polite smile I'd been wearing all afternoon. The same smile I'd used when he bragged about building his empire from nothing. The same smile I'd used when his stepchildren called me a quitter. The same smile I'd used when my own family treated me like a cautionary tale. "David," I said, reaching for the microphone, "I think it's time we were properly introduced." He handed it over. Whether from confusion or politeness, I couldn't tell. The feedback squealed for a moment as I adjusted the height, and then my voice carried across the silent lawn, reaching every guest, every family member, every person who had spent the afternoon wondering what the failure was doing here. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, But there are a few things I think you should know about the companies that made today's celebration possible, and about the person who's been funding them." My mother's face had gone completely white. David looked like a man who was starting to suspect that his perfect day was about to become very complicated. In the distance, the jet engines wound down to silence, but the truth I was about to unleash would be much louder than any aircraft. "Since everyone's been asking what I've been up to these past 5 years," I continued, my voice steady and clear, "I figured now would be a good time to share." The wedding reception that had written me off was about to learn exactly who they'd been dismissing. And I was just getting started. The silence stretched across the lawn like a held breath. 200 faces stared at me, waiting for an explanation that would make sense of private jets and business teams crashing their elegant celebration. I could see my mother gripping David's arm, her knuckles white against his dark tuxedo sleeve. 5 years ago, I began, my voice carrying clearly in the still air. I left medical school because I saw an opportunity in venture capital. My family thought I was throwing my life away. My mother told me I was a disappointment. I glanced at her briefly, watching her face flush with recognition and embarrassment. But sometimes, the biggest risks lead to the most unexpected rewards. David shifted uncomfortably beside me, still not understanding why his wedding reception had suddenly become my business presentation. You see, when you leave one world behind, you get to build a new one from scratch. And that's exactly what I did. I founded Apex Ventures, a venture capital firm that now manages over $300 million in assets across 43 companies. The murmur that rippled through the crowd was audible now, confusion mixing with disbelief. Uncle Jerome's jaw had literally dropped open. Cousin Michelle was staring at me like I'd just announced I was secretly a superhero. "Now, David," I continued, turning to face him directly, "you've been telling everyone about your incredible success story. How you built Innovate Flow from nothing. How hard work and determination created your empire." I smiled, the same polite smile I'd been wearing all day. "I think it's time we talked about what nothing actually looked like." His face had gone very pale. Something in my tone, or maybe the presence of my legal team, was clearly setting off alarm bells. "February 15th, 2020, I said, pulling out my phone and scrolling to the exact information I needed. A small software startup called Innovate Flow received its first major investment, $2.2 million through a shell company called Meridian Holdings. Do you remember that day, David? He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. You called it a miracle. An anonymous angel investor who believed in your vision when nobody else would. I paused, letting that sink in. That anonymous investor was me. The crowd erupted in whispers. I heard Aunt Janet gasp. Someone in the back called out, "What?" Loud enough for everyone to hear. But wait, there's more. I continued, enjoying the theatrical moment. Because over the next 5 years, as Innovate Flow grew and needed additional funding for expansion, for new technology, for market penetration, guess who kept writing the checks? David's face had gone from pale to gray. That's impossible. Sarah stepped forward from my team, opening her tablet with practiced efficiency. Meridian Holdings, Crescent Capital, Blue Ridge Investments, and Pinnacle Ventures, she read aloud. All shell companies owned by Apex Ventures. All providing funding to Innovate Flow at critical growth stages. In total, I said, taking back control of the narrative, I've invested nearly $11 million in your company over 5 years, which, according to the equity agreements you signed, gives me a controlling stake of 62%. The silence that followed was deafening. David looked like a man who'd just realized he was standing on quicksand. But here's the really interesting part. I continued. Last month, you mentioned that Innovate Flow was acquired by a major investment firm. You were so excited about the deal, about how it would set you up for the next decade. My mother had both hands pressed to her mouth now, staring at me like she'd never seen me before. That investment firm was Apex Ventures. My firm, which means, David, that as of this morning, I don't just own 62% of Innovate Flow. I smiled, pulling an envelope from my purse, the one document I'd been looking forward to delivering all day. I own all of it. Marcus stepped forward with a briefcase, removing several official-looking documents. The final acquisition papers were signed this morning at 30,000 feet, he announced to the crowd. Innovate Flow is now a wholly owned subsidiary of Apex Ventures. I handed David the envelope I'd been carrying. This is your termination notice, effective immediately, along with your severance package, which I think you'll find quite generous. David took the envelope with trembling hands, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't quite identify. Shock, betrayal, confusion, and something that might have been admiration. He started, then stopped. You've been controlling my company for 5 years. Funding it, I corrected. There's a difference. You built something incredible, David. The technology, the team, the vision, that was all you. I just provided the capital and the strategic guidance, usually through intermediaries, of course. I turned to address the crowd, many of whom were still staring at me with open mouths. So, when people ask me what I've been doing since I left medical school, the answer is this. I've been building the future. I've been funding innovation. I've been creating jobs and supporting entrepreneurs and proving that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the biggest rewards. My mother stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Zara, I had no idea. We never. You never asked, I said gently. You assumed that because I didn't follow your plan, I must have failed. But failure and success don't always look the way we expect them to. The wedding reception that had started as a celebration of David's empire had become something else entirely, a revelation about the real power behind the throne, and the daughter who had built an empire of her own while no one was watching. I looked back at table 18, still sitting empty by the kitchen door, then at the sea of faces staring at me with new understanding. Now, I said, handing the microphone back to David, I believe you were about to propose a toast? The aftermath was exactly what you'd expect when someone's entire world gets flipped upside down in front of 200 witnesses. David stood frozen with the microphone in one hand and my termination letter in the other, looking like a man trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The wedding guests erupted into chaos, hushed conversations, pointing fingers, and more than a few people pulling out their phones to Google Apex Ventures and Zara Williams. Uncle Jerome was the first to approach me, his earlier condescension replaced by something that might have been respect. Zara, I had no idea. 300 million? That's incredible. Thank you, I said simply, watching as other family members began gravitating toward me like I'd suddenly become magnetic. Cousin Michelle pushed through the crowd, her eyes wide with amazement. My God, you're famous, she breathed. I just looked you up. Forbes, TechCrunch, Wall Street Journal. How did we not know? You never asked, I repeated, the phrase that was becoming my theme for the day. But it was my mother I was watching. She stood apart from the growing crowd around me, still in her wedding dress, still beautiful, but looking like she'd just witnessed something that challenged everything she thought she knew about the world, about success, about her daughter. David, to his credit, managed to pull himself together enough to continue the reception. The band started playing again, servers resumed circulating with champagne, and gradually the shock began to settle into a new normal. But the energy had completely shifted. I was no longer the family disappointment lurking by the kitchen. I was the mystery woman who just revealed herself as the puppet master behind the groom's entire career. Zara? My mother's voice was soft, tentative. She'd finally approached me as the crowd began to disperse. Could we talk? Privately? I nodded, and we walked away from the reception toward a quieter corner of the lawn. The sun was beginning to set, casting everything in golden light that made the whole scene feel surreal. I owe you an apology, she said, the words coming out in a rush. I was wrong. About everything. About what you were doing. About what success looks like. About. She stopped, looking down at her hands. About you. Mom. No, let me finish. She looked up at me, and I saw tears forming in her eyes. I spent 5 years thinking my daughter had thrown her life away. I told people you'd made bad choices, that you were going through a phase, that maybe someday you'd come back to medicine and do something meaningful with your life. She laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. And the whole time, you were doing something I couldn't even imagine, building something I couldn't even understand. I tried to tell you, I said gently. Remember our last conversation? I tried to explain what venture capital was, what I was working on. You said I was playing with rich people's money. I know I did. She wiped her eyes carefully, trying not to smudge her makeup. I was scared, I think. Scared that if you succeeded doing something I didn't understand, it would mean I didn't know my own daughter. And I guess I was right about that. We stood in silence for a moment, watching the reception continue in the distance. David was making conversation with guests, probably trying to process what had just happened to his company and his life. My investment team was packing up their materials, having completed the business they'd come to handle. What happens now? My mother asked. With David?
He'll be fine.
The severance package is generous, and he's talented. He'll land on his feet. I paused, considering. With us? I don't know. That's up to you. She nodded slowly. I'd like to try. To get to know who you really are. If you're willing. I'd like that too. After she walked back to rejoin her wedding celebration, I found myself standing alone on the lawn, watching the sun set over a day that had gone nothing like anyone expected. My phone was buzzing with messages. Marcus updating me on the acquisition paperwork, Sarah confirming our flight plan for the return trip, 3 different business partners who'd somehow already heard about what happened at a wedding in Virginia. But I ignored them all and walked back across the lawn to table 18. The caterers had cleared most of the dinner plates, but they'd left a piece of wedding cake at each setting. I sat down in my assigned chair, next to the swinging kitchen door and the slowly melting ice sculpture, and took a bite of the untouched dessert. It was actually pretty good, vanilla with strawberry filling and buttercream frosting that was sweet without being overwhelming. From table 18, I had a perfect view of the entire reception. I could see my mother dancing with David, both of them probably trying to process the most surreal wedding day in history. I could see Uncle Jerome telling anyone who would listen about his niece, who owned a $300 million company. I could see Cousin Michelle showing people my Forbes article on her phone. But mostly, I could see myself clearly for the first time in years. Not the daughter who'd disappointed her family. Not the medical school dropout who'd made bad choices. Not the failure who'd been seated by the kitchen. I was Zara Williams, founder and CEO of Apex Ventures. I was the woman who'd built an empire while no one was watching. I was the person who'd learned that power doesn't need a front row seat because real power creates its own space. I finished my cake and smiled, watching the wedding celebration continue around me. Table 18 wasn't the worst seat in the house after all. It was exactly where I belonged.